but I can't read, I can't write, I can't spell, and most of the time I don't know my left from my right.
Now here's the thing about me that's a secret that most people don't know. I'm borderline retarded, and I can't read. These books that you're recommending, I would pick that up and I would be like, 10 minutes later, I'd be like, what's my favorite song? The ABCs?
I think we're kind of getting off topic. Can you name 10 books?
Keep going back to me. Can you?
Don't change.
No.
10 books.
You're changing the subject, actually.
10 books.
You're changing the subject,
okay,
actually.
3 books.
Okay. Well, the Game of Thrones series,
not a book.
Twilight series. It is a book.
Dress your age. Carrying a school bag on stage. What are you doing with a school bag on stage? You can't even read.
Hola. We got someone in the chat here. Jamistos Plethon. Hola. How's everyone doing? How you doing, Prude?
I'm doing great. It is a wonderful Monday night for us to think about what lies beneath our feet and to really consider the phrase, dust thou art and unto dust you shall return. And boy, oh boy, if we could ever start an episode on a series that focuses and takes us right back to the heart of the Middle East, I can only think to myself reading this book, damn, do I really miss Daniel Charles Barker.
Yeah, it's for a lot of people. We're going to get into this. This is deep. And you know what's funny? That a few listeners, once we announced this book, they went ahead and read it themselves or tried to read it. And I know some very serious people who made it like 50 pages in and just had to give up. But we stuck it out the entire time. We are, of course, talking about Cyclonopedia, the subtitle being Complicity with Anonymous Materials by Reza Negarestani. Honestly, I'm just going to be upfront. This is probably too early to say this. I'm probably going to call him Negrestani. So, like all throughout this thing, there's going to be, you're going to slow down. You're going to find slurs within slurs as I'm reading this guy's last name. And it ain't my fault. I'm going to try hard. But Cyclonopedia, let me ask you this. The title Cyclonopedia, what do you think that's about? Maybe I'm dumb. Maybe I'm a dumb psycho. Is there cyclones in this?
No, I don't. Not a single bit. There was no mention of cyclones or hurricane. Well, I can control F the text in a second to confirm that. But no, I didn't take away from any weather systems out of this text. Cyclonopedia is a book that references the ideas of Zoroastrianism, oil, wars in the Middle East, the global war on terror, all for you to really come out of this book and realize, damn, did Thomas Moynihan have a much better book?
I was about to, as I was reading this, not as I was reading, but as I was just finishing it, because I finished this a couple weeks ago, had some time to mull it over, and it gives you a newfound appreciation of spinal catastrophism. Because this book, Cyclonopedia, I think we're both in agreement that this is part of what we might call the CCRU expanded universe. The CCRU being, the Nicklandian sort of stuff. It's like spinal catastrophism. And on my show, Blood Satellite, we covered the CCRU collected writings, a few months ago. But as you're reading this, you'll recognize, oh, this is referencing a lot of that. And so you mentioned Daniel Barker earlier. That is the fictitious character that exists within that, what would you call it, area of study. It's this, I call it expanded universe because so much of it is fictitious. There's characters that connect to alternate timelines, all kinds of wild, kooky stuff. And this book, if I'm looking at, just the Wikipedia of it here, let me see if I could share the screen. Here is the author, Reza Negarestani. Cyclonopedia, he's pioneering the genre of theory fiction. Now, my suspicion is he wrote this Wikipedia himself because he is not a pioneer in the genre of theory fiction. That would be the character of Daniel Barker, the other CCRU stuff. This, I'm trying to go into this positive. I don't want to come out the gate all fiery and shit. But
Gio's got the right answer in chat. We just call him Nibistani for the rest of the night.
Gio, just 3-pointer. Nibistani. This is why we like Gio. He's saying the things that Gio can't say. Negarestani, like, interesting character. We're not going to get too much into his biography here, but um, I don't see this book as particularly pioneering. Now maybe I don't want to get too deep into this before giving you a chance to speak. What are your first impressions of this book?
Oh boy. My first impression, I read it once through last week, and then I read through it again today just to be fresh with the text. It felt I feel so bad for saying this because I'm sure this was a much bigger thing when this came out in 2008. But reading through the book, I just felt like, oh, this is something I would find in the wonderful world of the SCP Wiki, and I've read better stories on that forum. And I know that's terrible to say on one hand because there's some interesting stuff in here where there's the question about like oil and where do we get it from, and fossil fuels is a myth, and there's so many fun sort of esoteric or schizophrenic theories of analysis that you want to get onto. But I was incredibly frustrated with the fiction aspect of this because
Yes.
if we weren't already driven a little bit frustrated with the Charles Daniel Barker stuff with Moynihan and some of the CCRU stuff, this one takes it a step further to a point where it's borderline masturbatory. And I wasn't particularly a fan because the ideas that he's toying with, Zoroastrianism, war machines, and he's also playing this off of Baudrillard and being nomads, and then sort of the epicenter of sort of world religions, but also why are there always conflicts in sort of the Levant and in the Middle East and in Arabia in general? And it feels like, oh, what if I took all these cool ideas and concepts of like H.P. Lovecraft's, like the old ones, the elder gods, and I threw in a little bit of just like Babylonian mysticism, and then I smack dabbed right in the middle of the global war on terror as we're about to have the troop surge with Barack Obama. Like this, there's a perfect sort of formula here to create this awesome concoction of fiction and theory and just like shit that you and I would probably talk about if this book weren't written, or something that might be had said, in a That Feel When No GF documentary back when Campbot was, talking about theories and German idealism. Instead, I just get like I don't know. I wasn't unimpressed. Like he just like sort of put his dick on the table, and I was like, oh, this is not that great.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple interesting things there, and that list, that bullet point list of all the things he talks about, that's what got me into this book. And I heard it was about autonomous oil. It was about oil being alive in a sense. And I'd heard that before. That idea had been bouncing around the space. I'm like, oh, this is where it comes from. And he talks about, like you had said, the war in the Middle East and these sort of like interdimensional demons and Babylonian esoteric magic, all this stuff. I'm like, what I was looking for was, only a couple things. One, I want to hear about this fucking demon oil. And two, I want to hear a distinct Middle Eastern perspective on all this. I wanted to hear an Eastern perspective because, we're used to apprehending these ideas with a Western mind, but I like hearing it from, Asian or Middle Eastern perspective. Like, how would that differ? Now, the fact that he is Persian, I think, is very relevant because he is Persian and speaking in a very Western context about the Levant, about Afghanistan, about Iraq. So I found that the entire time he had sort of the tone of an outsider, the same way you or I might, talking about these places. And we'll get to the conclusions he gets to later on. But, I was looking for, I would have preferred if it was like an Afghani talking about this, if we're talking about the desert, if we're talking about the influence of oil on the mindset of that entire region. It just seemed like another Western academic for dealing with so much ancient lore and, strange numerology and magic.
Well, for all intents and purposes, I would almost, he's not Western. I mean, obviously he's Persian, but the way in which his academic career is and what he's still doing to this day is very Western. Like you wouldn't be doing these kind of conversations if not in the sort of art house, liberal arts university establishment places. And he has been busy. He was recently in Prague last October at the Academy of Fine Arts, and he was talking about intelligence and what that means for spirit. And he's apparently got a new book out called Intelligence and Spirit. But he's a self-described neo-rationalist. So that's another thing about this book. For as much as there is these intersections between Baudrillard, Deleuze and Guattari, and a lot of things that we would consider to be very much like cosmic horror, H.P. Lovecraft, and the rest, this book is incredibly materialistic and incredibly providing speculative, schizophrenic analysis on things that we would normally consider religious. So, for instance, if you're familiar with, the book of Ezekiel, if you're familiar with the Apocalypse of John, and it's often also known as the Revelation of John, and Gog and Magog get mentioned all the time.
Yeah.
And I mean, which is kind of fitting because if anyone recalls some of their George W. Bushisms, there is references that he's made to Gog and Magog when he spoke to the French president, to a point where the president of France at the time literally had to call some Protestants in France to ask what the fuck was George W. Bush talking about. So, I mean,
I love Esoteric Bush. I love genius CCRU Bush. That's the Bush that no one talks about.
The Bush that we deserve, that we never really got.
I'd never heard that story. This is the first I'm hearing about George Bush mentioning Gog and Magog to the French president and just blowing their fucking minds.
Like President Chirac is just he's become the one-shotted turbo normie to American evangelical dispensationalism.
You fucking zoom in on all those clown paintings Bush is making. It's just this fucked up numerological code. And this guy's he's been on a different wavelength this entire time. Cheney knew. Rumsfeld knew. No, that presidency's gonna age like fine wine. You mark my words. All right.
I wouldn't go that far.
I'm gonna go that far because I don't have a firm opinion on it. It just sounds good to say. If I knew more about, if I really believed in it, I wouldn't say it. But I don't believe it, so I'm saying it.
There you go.
So let's talk about how this opens. The introduction, which takes quite a bit of time. This is, in my opinion, there's two fictitious aspects to this book. One, it's that it's not a book written by this author. It's a collection of essay, or it's mainly about these essays written about this other fictitious person, and then on top of that, the intro is the story of this fictitious woman.
Book being published.
Yeah, and
this is very metafiction.
Yeah, it starts off with this. I don't think I'm being ungenerous when I say a random whore, and she meets someone on internet dating site, and she's taken in by his strange profile. And then he tells her, hey, come to Egypt. And she says, okay. And then she's on a plane to Egypt. And already I hate this story. There's nothing to grab onto here. Then she's trying to track down this guy. And then she goes into a bookstore and finds a clue. And then she's following clues and going to cafes. And all in
it's fiction because an American white woman goes to the Middle East and doesn't get kidnapped or raped.
Yeah, it's just, of course, the Persian mind cannot truly understand, the feelings of a white woman in the Middle East. But, she ends up with this collection of essays written by this, again, fictitious individual named Dr. Hamid Parsani, who we will be discussing at length in this review, who is this rogue, renegade professor who, like the author, studied in maths, and like the author was, I guess, drummed out and pursued esoteric research into weird shit and collected a cadre of followers around him. So, what I'm trying to say is that, and this will be maybe the first thing I say about the book, again, not trying to come in too negative, but my sense is if they removed all of the fiction from this book, it would be unchanged, because really what it is, it's the author, Reza, who just wrote a bunch of stuff, and maybe he wasn't that confident in it, because this reeks of unconfidence. If you just, it's a book about another book. It's a book sort of reviewing a selection of essays from this fake professor. I'm like, just write those essays. Just fucking write your theory down. Don't do this, tricky, cute little cope where you say, that's not me. I actually found this. And then that's why it ends abruptly, because the book has no conclusion. It just fucking ends because, he went insane from a skin disease and died. I'm like, okay, I'm not following you into your world. What really happened is you don't know how to end your fucking book. What really happened is you don't know how to write a book. So you said, hey, this bitch found half a book and here it is. But you don't piss on my fucking coat and tell me it's raining. Don't give me a half-baked hunk of shit and tell me that, isn't this wild? Isn't it weird? Here, yeah, I get that's wild. Here's the thing, it's fake. We know it's fake. You didn't invent theory fiction. These are undeveloped ideas. And if I need, you gave me a fucking IKEA set and said, build it yourself. Isn't this fun? No, it's not fun. Because at least with spinal catastrophism, a motherfucker put his name on it and said, here's my ideas. But don't say, like, you can't even own your own ideas. Just fuck off. It's just pathetic. Sorry, maybe I should have saved that to the end. Maybe I'll talk myself into liking it midway through. What do you think about all that?
And I thought I was going to be mean and cruel today. Man, well, plenty of things to where to begin. Like I said at the beginning, I feel like this is a SCP wiki story that I feel like has been written by better troons with more time than anything else on their hands, which is really sad because there are some really cool ideas that get fleshed out and toyed with here. Like, why is the Middle East, this region of the world, always been a center of conflict? Why are we driven to have all these insane religious notions that we get this like Jerusalem syndrome when we go into this parts of the world? What did the ancients, going back to the Akkadians and the Assyrians, like what did Sargon II know and his conflicts here? And it turns out that like we have these through lines that break through their period of time into ours, and eventually these X and Y axes all eventually collide. This is his Gog and Magog, and he's referencing like these 9-pointed stars, and he's referring to crosses and all this fun. It feels like I'm getting a version of The Mummy that may have been made into a film in an alternate universe where Brendan Fraser is like killing not mummies, but like gelatinous entities that have been covered with oil. Because once you get, coated with oil, it's almost like it's almost sexual in the way he talks about it. It's almost like sexual abuse, where he's just like, remember, kids, like if the oil gets on you, like that stain's never coming off. And it's just like, all right, Reza, tell us how you really feel about women. But you get everything from like the Venus of Willendorf in here, all these, artistic, religious, little statutes and everything, basically. And again, the problem is at the end of it all, like when he's got these ideas or he wants to like, how do I explain how do I got here? Like we bring in Dr. Hamid Parsani again, and it's just incredibly, I'm frustrated because there's some cool ideas here where like, well, actually all forms of religion, including like Zoroastrianism, which is like the ovum, the mother of all monotheistic religions, has brought us all here, and oil has found its perfect host in terms of religion, which is Islam, and the Islam, particularly the Wahhabistic Islamic interpretation of the apocalypse, according to Islam, will rise up and oil will do it. And they call, so in one things that, they say about what oil will bring about the end of our understanding of the world, or our eschaton, is an Islamic eschaton. So like these phallic structures, the idols will be destroyed. And of course, for in the Islamic eschaton, like Christ returns and he destroys all the crosses and things like that. And so, these idols are destroyed. And then, of course, oil wanting to compete with quote unquote solar capitalism, where like the rays and the heat of the sun, Earth too will burn and be its own thing. And, will be able to finally compete itself. And then it has this intersection with like, well, actually capitalism can't compete against this like demonic elder being that's beneath the earth, and the earth is actually hollow, but that's because there's like the oil that lives there, and it comes in here, and
it almost endorses capitalism in a sense. We talk about
almost, despite it being very anti-capitalist.
And when capitalism emerges in this book, it seems sudden and almost random to me, because it's developing all these other ideas, and then here's solar capitalism, but none of that really matters. And you had mentioned something very important there, which is the view of Islam. And this is why I said that his Persian heritage is extremely relevant, because I don't believe he's a Muslim. I did a bit of research. I couldn't find any evidence that he was. So you can finish this book believing that jihadis, Muslims generally, but Islamists more specifically, are the ultimate cancer on earth, and that they are possessed by this, interdimensional war machine that is manifesting through oil, and that Islam is the only true religion in the sense that it truly surrenders itself to this sort of negative force that seeks to destroy. Like, it is pure war. It doesn't just employ war like the West would, like America would. It has not given itself up to this essence. And that essence is, like I said, manifested in oil, but it's also something else entirely. And so, he makes the case that America is ill-equipped to really grapple with the Islamic threat, but only insofar that, the Muslims are like true negation given human form. And so the fact that he's not a Muslim and he doesn't seem to be terribly friendly to the region, I think that's what gave it its outsider view, in my opinion.
Yeah, it has sort of I almost want to say an ex-Muslim, or to how Yarvin talks about atheists, like, you can be a Protestant atheist, you can be a Buddhist atheist, you can be a Muslim atheist. And I feel like that's what we get here, because Reza is a rationalist, or at least, claims to be one. He's very materialistic in his analysis, and based on my research of the guy when I was reading in other parts. And so, he really he just says that in this theory fiction text that we're covering tonight, that Reza says, well, actually, all forms of creation myths are just byproducts of ancient stories that had been long since buried in the sands of Persia and in the sands of these ancient empires. And according to our Parsani guy, like, this has just been part of an ever ongoing series of wars, holocausts, and genocides of this region to hide the fact that oil has been controlling all facets of the world. And now that mankind is in a world where capital requires heat, so think about how Nick Land quotes Tom DeLillo in Meltdown about heat and cities and energy and expenditure of energy, that now all of a sudden we ourselves need to allow this heat to come to the surface, and that surface heat must only come through war. And oil itself, as it goes through tubes, not just oil pipelines, but literally tubes in the earth, these Terulian lubricants, as he calls them, about the earth, that itself as an organism will use our ideologies, and use our religions to be these sort of xenomatriarchs that will birth the way in which oil can finally reign supreme. These elder gods finally get to come and exist. And again, it's like hits blunt. This is interesting, and this could only definitely be written at the height of of global war on terror, but it's also like very half-baked.
Yeah, and we were talking about this leading up to the show, where like, I'll follow you down that road. Okay, oil is, I'm using this word a lot, manifestation, but it's sort of like this demonic entity that it's the lubricant for the engine of war. The engine of war is this entity unto itself. But then you think about it for, 10 seconds, and then you think, well, I mean, what about all the wars that weren't driven by oil? How about the Peloponnesian War? You know what I mean? Like, name a fucking war, So the idea is, I get that we're at the apex of, because of capitalism, now we are drawing oil from the ground. So that has changed the nature of war. But like, the connection between oil and warfare is very, very flimsy. Like all war, or the concept, the Platonic ideal of war. You would be more correct to say that there's other forces, other metaphysical phenomena that are causing war. But just to say, it has anything to do with oil, that to me, and we'll get into this more as we talk about the book, is that he was looking at the news. He was looking at what's around him. The war in the Middle East. Again, this was written in 2009, I believe. So for those
2008 is when it was published.
Yeah. And so right around that time, like you had correctly said, this is the height of the war on terror. So it's the top of everyone's mind. And if you weren't switched on at that time, you don't really know what it was like back then. I'm old enough to remember. I'm sure you are too. But a lot of the young guys, they don't. Like, it was a different mindset back then. So everything was about oil. So you're laser focused on oil and you're trying to be poetic. You're trying to say, how is this everything? What can we say here? And you take that, and like you had mentioned before, it's very materialist, very utilitarian. So you're taking a very real substance and trying to metasize it in a sense. And I'm like, okay, I see what you're doing. I'm unconvinced because it sounds dumb. It sounds reductive. Like there'd be a better way to discuss oil. Because what I was hoping going in was, as I had said at the start, more about the demonic nature of oil. And he talks about that for maybe the first quarter, but he doesn't spend that long on it because he goes into dust. He goes into all these other topics, which are interesting. There's a few pillars of this book that we'll get to, but the first one is the demonic nature of oil. I was hoping to get a bit more about, like, what is it? How does it move? Because at various points in the book, he'll say it's this totally metaphysical inorganic substance, but also maybe it's all the dead bodies on Earth at once. So maybe it's inhuman and it's superhuman at the same time. And he just plops that down. He plops it on the table in front of you and says, oh, maybe it's these two contradictory things. Like, it's very blurred. It's very fuzzy. And I don't like that. But he's just saying oil, philosophically, it lubricates violence. I'm like, well, you're just saying philosophically because what you mean to say is practically. What you mean to say is, yes, technologically, oil is very important to guns and warfare, but I don't think you can just project that over the entirety of war as such. That's a reach to me.
Yeah, and again, you have to be very careful because half of what he's referencing is based in theory, based in actual historical places, events, people, excavation sites, but then also it is hit so hard with fiction and this Parsani character. So basically, you have to be very careful as to where this goes and where it doesn't. So, for instance, like we talk about early on, he talks about how we have the X and Y. For him, it's the Gog and Magog that he references here, and we have to realize that our numerical understanding of the world, it has its bonds, and these connections are more than one, but not more than two. And so everything is dichotomous, and which means we have the divine, but we also have the decadence. And he does a lot of wordplay here. So like we have decadence as a realization. And this means that we're going to have degeneration rising and progressing from one end of this. And that also, you can compare this to the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments, which are what might be seen as like perfect forms of ethics in terms of the divine. And these two will clash. And when they clash, you either get spirals, which we might see in the helix, whether that be DNA, whether that be the helix or the spirals that we see of the spiraling snakes in our medicinal symbols, or even in various forms of Western and Middle Eastern architecture. And in doing so, he says that when we have all these things based off this, ancient cross, the cross of Ankh, and its broken star, 9-some sorcery, it brings us to, these vertices. And this leads us to the triangle, and this is where you'll see the word trisomy a lot. We're not talking about genetic conditions, although we do not discriminate against our wonderful listeners. Instead, we're, bringing this into all sorts of Zoroastrian, Islamic, and Christian traditions about threes and the exploitation of threes. And, 3 dots for the Zoroastrians was considered a perversion or a disorder. And instead, this will later be revived throughout all sorts of things. And you get things like the Deva get mentioned. You get all these other, older terms and older religions, all these older languages from the Middle East that are going to get brought up throughout here. And then, of course, any times that he doesn't know where to finish it, he's just like, Parsani's notes continue on to the next page, which have been lost. And you're just like, okay, I got it. This is how it's going to be, and this is what I'm in for. And I'm only like 30 pages into the.
I couldn't read to the edge of the torn notebook. Okay. Fun. Are you having fun? Are you having fun with like incomplete notes yet? So we've got speaking of spirals. We got the feedback spiral. This is an image in front of you for those who are listening on audio. This won't make any sense to you. There's actually no way to describe this other than a drunk corkscrew. Just to give you a sense of the type of writing in this, and I'm dropping you right in the middle here. It says, a feedback spiral mobilizes and prolongs the communications of trisons, also known as political. So he's taking the word political and being cute. Units of the Middle East. Feedback spiral employ and this is probably just the copy of the book. I know you're working with the same copy. I can't tell if he's
I looked up some other versions on there are a few YouTube reviews of this book to a degree of popularity, and they're either using the same one we are, or their copies have the same kind of crappy notes and it was purposefully published that way. I don't know. I need to get my hand on a physical copy. I cannot believe I'm gonna have to buy this book.
Yeah,
but I'm going to.
Let's buy the book to verify that he's being this annoying with how he's writing it, with like typos on purpose. Because
I think it is on purpose, because even the stuff that other people were saying and citing this is that it's written that way deliberately. So I mean, for instance, there are times in here where like the word God gets used, capital G God, but it's spelled cod, like the fish.
Right, yeah, cod. The entire book, God is written as cod. So I'm like, this is on purpose, but why? Why are you doing
and political, this? And poly, I mean, that's a popular way to satirize politics. And I mean, like, okay, I get what we're doing here. It requires me to do, I guess, maybe a third read through. But I mean, to me, I feel like I'm getting a mix of, understanding the farcicalness of our own sort of like our realist world of politics. And at the same time, like, actually, no, there's something much deeper here being at play. And the things that are at play in this current, world of conflict and of abiotic oil, that we have to understand that it's actually alive. Then all of a sudden, we're now going to have to deal with those consequences. And those consequences are immanentizing an eschaton in the war that is the global war on terror.
Let me just call attention to one comment here by Johnson. It says he's doing diagrammatic philosophy wrong. Let me try. The oil demiurge generated wars to advance the capital process and now fuels war itself with the goal of expanding war across the universe. Because that's not what he's saying in the book, but that would make sense to me. You know what I mean? What do you think about that? That would be more reasonable, I think. And that would be more in line with what I think he wants to make the capitalistic argument, which is that's in line with the Marxist theory that, okay, capitalism unlocked something. But when he casts it back on history and says it was always there, you are contrasting it against the fact that, well, that doesn't really make sense. You're casting modernity back through history, and it just doesn't gel.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this just it doesn't. Not to reference Elon Musk or anything, but it really doesn't grok all that well to how he's doing it. And I mean, again, I'm not one that's big on this stuff. I'm not an expert. I don't know a lot about sort of the graph work that he's doing here, or how much of it is based on how you would do these kinds of things with language or theory. But you have to take it at the face value with the book that you're given. And I went along with it because half of this, I mean, if not all of it, is just completely fiction anyways. And the theory is sort of building off of the fiction, because the fiction is the narrative device in which we get to his ideas about oil, war, and Islam. And okay, so be it. I'll play it completely straight. And so for right now, that's what you've got on screen, or that's what we've been talking about. And those are the things where we see that things from the past are going to intersect to today, and things from today are going to intersect from behind in this recurring feedback loop that is eventually going to be very violent, and they will collide.
Hey, 10N, I'll have what he's having. But here's the thing about Reza is that, as I said, he went to a fairly prestigious university, as far as I understand, in Iran, and he majored and focused in maths. So, that made me look at this differently. Like when you have what we're seeing in front of us here, Trison cells generating feedback spirals have had significant roles in presenting the Middle East as an alternative Earth dissident to the world's policies, and their zeal in evolving chronologically and or environmentally relevant political approach. You see where, like, I can see his math background. He likes the graphs, he likes the numerology because he likes numbers, right? And he likes the region politically because he lives there, of course. And he likes the narrative because it's written in a time when the war on terror is at its apex. So he's got these three things. And I think he's trying to weld them together. But I think if you just approach each of these independently, it'll be much better, because what he wants to do is just talk about the war in the Middle East and oil, right? And maybe if he just did that with, occult history, that would be one thing. But once you start having this sort of mathematical numerology on top of it, and you start throwing all these diagrams at us, I just don't think it works. I think you need to pick one thing to talk about. And maybe it would have even been better if he didn't even talk about oil to begin with, because the second half of the book is all about like dust and decay and jihadis. Like you can kind of have a dividing line through the book about when it switches over from oil to this other thing, and then that really takes us to the end. But I'm like, and the second half of the book is where the most interesting stuff to me is. What do you think about all that?
I don't think I'm going to be as harsh when it comes to how the book is broken up, because I thought that there was a pretty solid K line through all of this from the very beginning to the end. Like we're introduced to artifacts, we're introduced to this character and all of his writings, both complete and incomplete, and referencing texts and essays that don't exist. And so it's like, okay, I'm on an adventure, and I'm going to treat this like I'm on an adventure, hell or high water. And so I get everything from strange woman, online dating, strange literature that must be broken out in the mainstream because the people who are all part about this are all exiled academics from their home countries and are now starting these institutes for hyperstition and the rest. And the hyperstition thing is a whole other can of worms that we can get into, because if we're going to like bring about something via hyperstition, like the book itself is kind of like to reference other kind of like, strange theory fiction, like it's an info hazard. It's a cognito hazard of sorts, where it's like being aware of this text is now aware of the fact that like Reza and Parsani and everyone involved even reading this are trying to bring about some kind of Islamic style apocalypticism, because the agent of oil is now something that they're aware of and they have to work with it. It's almost like Rocco's Basilisk meets the global war on terror and like OPEC. And it's a fun thing. It's fun. I there's some things I can look about this, be like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's clever. But you get everything included from 1,000 plateaus, and then we start going through, gematria and what leads and equals everything, like current Nick Land Twitter timeline stuff with the numerology and whatnot. But I mean, nevertheless, what little coherency is in this text makes for a fun and interesting read if you're willing to accept for what it is, which is schizophrenic analysis in a literary narrative device of just, fictional academia.
And I think now is a good time to just read a few bits from this that really set up the book. And this is from the introduction, but it'll give you a sense of the writing style, and it really frames the entire story like a film. So it says 11, and this is from the perspective of the young woman who's doing a travel log of going after this random guy she met on Tinder who was autistic enough to gain her interest. This is 11 March 2004. Somewhere amidst the fog of the net, behind a seemingly forgotten website, in Hyperstition's password-protected laboratory, a location for exploring a diverse range of subjects from the occult to fictional quantities, from war machines to bacterial archaeology. Actually, this isn't the girl part. This is a bit later on. My mistake. Anyway, and decimal sorceries, Kabbalah, schizomath, decimal labyrinth, and tick xenonotation. And if you've read any of the CCRU stuff, this will sound familiar. You know what tick systems are. you know what decimal labyrinths are. It's not necessary to know them for reading this book, but once you see that, you're like, oh, this is definitely CCRU stuff. He's just peppering that in there. And swarming with retrograde academics, pyromaniac philosophers, and cryptogenetic autodidacts. There's a tumultuous discussion. The commotion has begun over a newly discovered note from the former professor of Tehran University, the archaeologist and researcher of Mesopotamian cultural meltdowns, Middle East, and ancient mathematics, Dr. Hamid Parsani. There he is. Following his reappearance in late 2000, Parsani started a project for locating an artifact named the Kaj Ankh, or the Cross of Ankh. Parsani's old friends all confirmed that they found him too unstable and lacking in the principled behavior expected from a scholar. An old colleague describes him regretfully as a, and remember, I think this is Reza talking of himself, as a volatile genius entertaining a bunch of teenage nitwits. He constantly rambles about a heretic Zoroastrian mage and sorcerer named Ankh, who was mentioned in the Zoroastrian books, Denkard and Yashivit Firun. These rants concern Ankh's cross, his last three riddles, which went unanswered, something like flowing source of the black flame, an omnipresent blob worshipped by Ankh Yatu, a cult led by Ankh during his lifetime and after his execution. The Quranic references of Gog and Magog, the people of the eye, and many other topics usually entertained, and this is your quote, usually entertained only by unhealthily minded teenagers who, neglecting their schoolwork, think such nonsense to be cool. I mean, I can't disagree with that. So that really sets up, I think, the foundation of what we're talking about here. This is the character of this guy. This is sort of what they're talking about. And the idea of the Hyperstition community being just ramped up for the discovery of this notebook. The notebook, which contains several essays, one of which I believe is called Defacing the Ancient Persia, something like that.
Yeah, 9,500 years of destruction. Like it's one of the things that gets referenced throughout the book. So, I mean, there's a lot of reference to ancient, early Mesopotamian religion, which we don't, I mean, I wish we knew more of. But of course, that whole area is very hard to do archaeology these days. So, for instance, Tiamat, which is sort of the groundwater, the primordial sea, which is part of the Babylonian creation myth when on high, referred to as a woman in some parts, but also just a woman or some sort of figure with breasts and a tail, bears the first generation of deities after mingling her waters with those of Apsu, her consort. And so when Reza asks about the Middle East, like, is it Islamic? Is it Zoroastrian? Was it Christianized? What is it? And he's like, well, actually, it's like TM materialistic, wherein it's about the water underneath. And for Reza, that means the oil. That means what is churning through these holy places, HOLEY, through the earth, which they're then brought up. And because these peoples, these Persians, these people who've been here forever, they have the only sort of psychological mentality to sort of handle those waters. This is why, like, the West is unprepared to deal with the Middle East, and that, to a point where he even calls out OPEC as like man's hubris and trying to control like the Tiamatic world that lies underneath. And so it's like, okay, this is where we're at. I'm fine with it. I can roll with it. But like, if you don't know anything, or if you're not willing to do like even a brief cursory search of various deities of, the Akkadian times or the Assyrian Empire, we also get references to golems, but not just in like the Jewish sense, but like we have these war machines, and these war machines are everything from the Lamassu, which were those man-headed bulls with wings, and the that were part of like Assyrian religious and other forms of sculpture and iconography. And it's like, okay, this is what we're dealing with, and this is the kind of world that exists in. War has always been part of it. And it's not so much that oil is the cause of all wars, but rather that the war, the peoples that have existed inside the Middle East, the Levant, whatever you want to call it, have been the people best suited by oil to bring about its apocalypticism that it wants to do. It wants to challenge the sun. It wants to burn as bright. It wants to be better than the sun, because in fact, oil is this organic thing, and then there is an organic world or consciousness, an elder being underneath the earth, and we ourselves have just been infected by it, and our religious expressions, our understandings are all second order consequences of myths and events that take place long before we could really write it down. There's references to the flood, there's references to all sorts of things in here, and then basically like, oh, we've always had war machines, and he's building off of that nomad, piracy, war machine stuff from Baudrillard. And in fact, from there, you get all these strange complexities in which Reza wants to tell you flat out, like, the global war on terror is just a, picture of what is to come as the world continues to evolve itself, and sort of the quote unquote heart of the world, the beginning of the world, the water that is not above the heavens, but the water that is below the earth, that will bring about some kind of end. And that's where the Islamic apocalypticism really comes to the forefront.
And the part I like about the book, and this might be me auto completing it, but if I had to think of the main thematic arc of the book, it's sort of like it's about entropy. When he talks about dust, when he talks about decay, when he talks about, like you said, holy space. And like he talks about not only holes in the ground, but also plot holes as these incursions of this sort of war machine essence, that the earth itself, and correct me if this paraphrasing is incorrect, but the earth itself is a battleground. He said, like, what was it? Again, paraphrasing, but matter attracts antimatter, or that being attracts anti-being. It wants to pierce it. It wants to move within it and tear it apart and inhabit it. So there's this sense that like holes manifest as through some other dimension. So and he talks about plot holes, right? You or I might think of, and this is convenient to this book, I'm sure, but a plot hole is something of an oversight by the author. But no, a plot hole is something ontological. Plot hole is something you can get lost in. It's almost like another dimension piercing through the story, like a lapse in logic or something, but it's something else. It's like a knot. It's like a Gordian knot arriving from some other place. And holy space, of course, is a reference to the holy rusted metal Batman line from Batman Forever. Holy space, it's the space of a hole. It is what it sounds like when you dig a hole. What is that? What is that space in a hole? You've removed something, but it is a new space in itself. Something has come through that hole. That is more or less what he was saying. Is that your understanding of holy space?
Yeah, and also that, again, talking about meta narrative and metafiction, just we have a convenient excuse as to why we don't have complete ideas. Is that it's literally part of the world that he's constructed, both in the eons of history, but also in the fact that we don't have all of Parsani's notes.
Yeah, so we would call that a feature, not a bug. The fact that it's incomplete is like, aha, see, this isn't me. This is the oil monster. But it's just one different version of this bigger problem, of this. I'm saying something he didn't say, but to me, this is just like the demon of entropy coming through in different forms, which makes, and it's arriving through the ground, it's arriving through holes, it's arriving through oil, like you had said, to wage war against solar capitalism and completely destroy the earth, which is using a lot of imagery that spinal catastrophism use, the earth as this punished place, earth as this place where it's inevitable that hell will arrive to earth, either through humans or through, like, it's just a place, it's a sponge for violence. And you had made an interesting comment, I forget where, but you had said, well, I'm going to paraphrase you here, but it was, why is it that these sort of atheists, they only have demons? There's no gods, it's only demons. There's no salvation, it's only punishment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So One Eye Moon here saying demons again. Did you want to expand? Did you notice that too? Like these guys, they could only the only supernatural essence they could ever believe in is something that is to bring pain to you. And just the fact that I'm seeing this across so many different works, I think that's one of the most consistent things in the entire CCRU corpus.
Well, also because of what are you fucking with in the CCRU corpus? I mean, between the gematria and then the literal references to both ancient and post temple destruction demonologies. I mean, that's sort of what gets played with the most. And at the end of the book, you get just a huge list of glossary terms, which all have their numbers, which all have some explanation as to how they got here. What is Babylon? It's the former gate to the outside in the Middle East. We're talking about everything that could come from there, and what does that mean with these numbers specifically? And really, that's a big part of all of this included. I'm not too brought up on it other than like this is what we're referencing here. But also, I mean, if you're working primarily with, say, Abrahamic religions, and you're working within the conceptualization of both, say, Christianity, but more specifically in this instance about the book Islam, we have, of course, we're referencing, what they would call demons. And I hate to reference a lot of Twitter stuff, but like the whole discussion of like being jinn-brained, with Road, or the Djinn or genie, where we get that word. Like there's a lot of that in here wherein.
Could you explain that a little bit? By the way, before I forget,
Oh, sure.
User
let's-
B had mentioned the theme of this book is Djinnflation.
Yeah, do not research, by the way. We don't want that to happen.
do not go in there.
Yeah, don't go in there. Don't talk about Jin brain or anything like that. So I mean, I think the concept itself basically more or less got popularized by Kunli Drupka on Twitter, who's a great satirist in a lot of ways. He says a lot of people are unable to understand processes in terms of anything other than being because of motivated agency. Bad things happen because they're the work of a malevolent spirit or a jinn, a type of jinn brain where they literally cannot understand complex systems. And so it's the sort of contemporary, like, there are evolving decentralized systems or complex systems that allow for all these things to happen versus the, brown mid IQ brain range of like, oh, a jinn did it, a genie did it. And it's sort of this idea that there's always a malevolent actor that's happening in here. And for this book, like you could say like, well, actually, this kind of is the epitome of a jinn brained idea, wherein there is an elder being underneath the earth, which is oil, which is infected of people that have been part of Persia since like time immemorial, since the creation of the earth. And we can examine this through all the religions that have spawned out of it, from early Mesopotamian religions to Zoroastrianism to Islam today, and all of them are infected. There's this like germ line that has infected man's understanding and consciousness, and it's actually because there is this being that's doing it. So in this case, even in Islam, like what are jinn? Demons. There are these things in which we should, you should avoid and not make deals with, and the rest. And so, but the one that is the ultimate thing that has created the world that we know is, of course, the oil and the being underneath the earth.
Yeah, and to be clear, this being is war. In so many words, that's where war comes from. And of course, we would interpret that as saying, of course, it's accelerated now due to oil, or we might say that it was a new type of war was introduced through oil, but it would say that no, it's the same force, it's the same demonic force creating war that also feeds upon itself. It's this Ouroboros of war, which hopefully we'll get to in a little bit. He goes into a bit more detail on that, but let me just make sure I read some more from the book, because I think to do it justice and to steelman his position, I think we need to get a bit more of this. So on front of us, we have the Cross of Ankh. He says the Cross of Ankh has frequently been referred to as the broken star, the starhead, or the black sunflower. In his notes, Parsani personifies the cross of Ankh as an inorganic demon, a sentient relic with the ability to numerically grasp all the undercurrents and inconsistent events of the earth as modes of narration. And you're seeing the introduction of narration and plot holes and things like that. It can narrate the plot holes of every planetary scenario, from textual narrations to global political narrations, Parsani writes. Idolized by Hamid Parsani as a supreme narration lube, the Cross of Ankh delineates the activities of ontogenesis of global dynamics according to the lubricating chemistry of oil or petroleum, i.e., it grasps all narrations of the earth through oil. The Cross of Ankh and its transformations offer a diagram for the intrepid blasphemy of the Middle East against all modes of global hegemony and political modes which perceive global dynamics as a whole. So just to restate it there, you start to see very early on in the book, he is casting like Middle Eastern politics as this very rebellious force against all sorts of global hegemonies, and is its destiny is to be anti-hegemonic. You know what I mean? Like it will always be that which tries to destroy global order, which I think, I'm not trying to, divine his particular politics. I don't know where he stands now politically, but at the time, just saying that the Middle East is destined to be the eternal entropic force on Earth is a pretty daring claim, I say.
Goes pretty hard though. I'm not gonna lie. It's a fun narrative complex to use, that we have an outsider here that's going to bring about all of the end.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading some notes here. So just to move on to the oil part here, I'm jumping to page 33. And if you have any other parts you'd like to focus on, I can pass
I
it
do, but it starts at page 84, so you go ahead.
All right, so going here, it says, according to the classic theory of fossil fuels, excluding Thomas Gould's theory of the deep hot biosphere, and we don't talk a lot about that in the book, but there's this theory, there's the fossil fuel non-renewable resource theory, which is that there's a limited amount of oil. It's from dinosaur bones. It's from dead organic material, not just dinosaur bones, but dead organic material. And we're going to run out one day. We will reach peak oil and then it's all over. There is the counter theory, and I believe this is the deep hot biosphere, which is that we don't know what forces in the earth create oil. It could be just a renewable substance. We don't actually know that much about what goes on beneath the surface. So it could just be a thing the planet does. So we're not going to debate that, but I'm friendly to that theory. It says petroleum was formed as a tellurian entity under unimaginable pressure and heat in the absence of oxygen and between the strata in absolute isolation. A typical Freudian Oedipal case. Then petroleum's Hadean formation developed a satanic sentience. Because I made a point, I'm like, I can't remember if he outright uses the word Satanism in the book, but now I'm reminded that he does. The satanic sentience through the politics of in-between, which inevitably wells up through the God complex deposited in the strata to the surface, envenomed by the totalitarian logic of the tetragrammaton, yet chemically and morphologically depraving and traumatizing divine logic. Petroleum's autonomous line of emergence is twisted beyond recognition. So you see, when we talk about oil, we're not just talking about this dark substance. We really do mean petroleum. And so just moving on to 34, I just want to sort of underscore some of the ideas that we were talking about before. And so at the top of the page, you see here the desert of, he means the desert of God, but all throughout the book, you see Cod and then God used interchangeably with seemingly no rhyme or reason. So he says, monotheism in its ultimate scenario is the call for the desert, the monopolistic abode of the divine. In the end, everything must be leveled to fulfill the omnipotence and oneness of the divine. So that for radical jihadis, the desert is the ideal battlefield. To desertify the earth is to make the earth ready for change in the name of the divine's monopoly. And, this is the idea I find the most attractive once he starts going on about the desert and the grand leveling everything, because you could hear this criticism from other people that there's nothing in its truest state. And we are talking about Charles Cochrane recently. We were talking about this book, The Disenchantment of the World, and the Germanization of early medieval Christianity. There's this idea that in its truest Eastern form, Christianity was an individualizing, relationship with the hereafter. And it's only through its introduction to Europe that it takes on what I would argue is the Europeanized Christian form that we all know. We actually don't engage with Christianity the same way the ancients would have. It's this other thing that is so codified with European culture and folk ways and saints and everything else. And then comes Protestantism and then all that. So it might be true to say that in its truest form, it should be stripping the material, all forms of materialism, all forms of ritual from life. And so I can kind of see where he's coming from, the monotheism, Islam being the example, but maybe the most pure form of Christianity would be just leveling of fucking everything. Right. And then in his view, Islam is the only one that actually does that, which is why it's, in his mind, maybe the only actual religion, the only real monotheism. It says, so that the desert is the ideal battlefield. In the line with Wahhabi and Taliban jihadis, for whom every erected thing, so to speak, every verticality is a manifest idol, the desert, as militant horizontality, is the promised land of the divine. They want God, but what they get is Tellurian Omega, the incinerating immanence with the sun and the earth's core assembled on the axis, which knows nothing of authoritarian divine and monopolistic convergence, the hell engineering access of the earth. It seems, therefore, that both the techno-capitalist process of desertification in War on Terror and the radical monotheistic ethos for the desert converge upon oil as an object of production, a pivot of terror, a fuel, a politico-economic lubricant, and an entity whose life is directly connected to the earth. Oil lubes the whole desert expedition towards Tellurian Omega. In this case, petroleum is a terrestrial replacement for the onistic self-indulgence of the sun or solar capitalism. Earth dismantles the hegemony of the sun on a subterranean bio-objective level. So I think that actually ties together a lot of the notes and kind of brief ideas we were talking about earlier. And that really summarizes all of it. So looking at Vingle here, why is Dimes reading out AI prose poetry?
Long before that. But actually, it's a good jumping off point if you wanted to go to on the PDF page 84, and I can read a little bit from there.
Page 84.
Yeah, it'll start with the Z monologue.
Pipeline Odyssey. Here we go.
Yep, Pipeline Odyssey. So this will intersect with everything that Dimes was just talking about, and also a little bit of the sort of Islamic apocalypticism we've been talking about. So to understand the militarization of oil and the dynamism of war machines in the war on terror, one must grasp oil as the ultimate Tellurian lubricant, or a vehicle for epic narratives, which we're kind of getting both in the book, but also what he's talking about. To instrumentalize oil through production, to impose any authorial line on this narrative carrier, is like feeding on the devil's excrement or its derivatives. There is always the danger of being poisoned to death, or even worse. In contemporary Islamic references to radical jihad as a global process, the Islamic approach towards the mobilization of tactics is explained as defense as opposed to offense. In the Islamic approach, that is a way of jihad, Islamic war is delineated by defense, diffusion, and life support contagion, while the crusading war machines, or Western lines of tactics, are mapped on the plane of the offensive, escalation, and militant intrusion. Therefore, the Western incursive dynamism of tactics is always considered un-Islamic because it perceives war as a manifest dynamic progression of war machines, which inevitably turns into something basically intrusive because such obsessively dynamic war machines intrinsically transgress and penetrate borders. I exist because I move definitely makes you persona non grata in some places. Such vigorous dynamism, Western man, cannot operate remotely or strike the enemy without transgressing borders and territories. The Western Crusade and its approach to war machines cannot be emulated by Islam because of its quality of dynamism does not correspond to the laws of Islam, and the belief that transgression is idolatrous because all lands and territories belong to the divine, not to war machines and their tactics. For Islamic jihad, everything must operate as defense. I don't really buy that nowadays or at all, because I don't think a car of peace really gives a fuck about borders.
Yeah, like he is factually
some hardcore
well, that's the thing, like he's geopolitically incorrect, he's factually wrong, but this is going back to what I said earlier, that he seems to write this from a distinctly Westernist perspective. I can imagine that paragraph coming from any one of our friends.
I could imagine this paragraph being a modern retelling of Evelyn's Metaphysics of War talking about jihad.
Like he's saying the idea that, like, I would like to clip that and attribute it to someone else and see if people could tell the difference, saying that I exist because I move. You would see that on some...
I exist because I move. Logo dataless.
Yes. The unceremonious third mic of Do You Even Read, Logo dataless, who's always spiritually present, of course. But yeah, like the idea that as Westerners, you exist because you move. Your war is incursion. It is conquest. And there's, I see what he's getting at, and it's not necessarily true, but it's sort of like the invitation of war. We are inviting war to us. We're trying to, because that's what a lot of the critics of the war on terror would say. It's like, oh, you're entering their battlefield. They're drawing you into a war so it can consume you. Again, I don't think that's more of it's not a comment on Islam broadly. Maybe he's just trying to say these particular jihadis.
Oh, no, keep going, because it gets into Islam more in depth, and I think in this monologue here we can keep going for a second. I will say this in terms of just talking about geopolitics and talking about war and offense and defense. There is no mention of Israel in this book at all, with the exception of saying a drawing was found in the part of the Golan Heights that Israel owns. That's it. That's it. I'm just noting a geopolitical observation inside of this text. You're not going to see that mentioned at all, and you are only going to see Zion mentioned once, and it is the literal south side of Mount Zion. When we talk about the Dung Gate in Nehemiah 2:13 near the
I remember that.
That's about it. That's it. I'm just saying, for the sake of for a guy talking about the war on terror and current events, that country in the Middle East or that part of the world does not get mentioned at all.
It's in the context of the war on terror, which you can't ignore it. You can't say Israel was not relevant to that discussion. It is bizarre that it's not mentioned at all. And honestly, I was so deep into the numerology and then esoterica, I didn't even notice that. And I'm striking myself in repentance. I should have noticed that. my I don't even know if I could qualify as a noticer anymore. I think I might be fucked. So did you want to keep reading here about anything?
Yeah, I'll keep reading. That was really funny. The asymmetry is not the asymmetry of warfare, but that of the principles of war itself. If, according to Islam, jihad cannot be transgressive or intrusive, it must be conducted merely as pure defense, then how is possible to uphold the responsibility of making the earth ready for the divine, of making Islam a global religion rather than a Middle Eastern or Africo-Asian cult? The answer lies either in the invention or discovery of new war machines, whose means of offense is that of peaceful communication. I'm sure the Christmas markets in Germany would know a thing or two about that. Or the engineering a peaceful and non-transgressive medium or vehicle to host the war machines of jihad.
Vehicle. Poor choice of words.
Poor choice of words. But in this, he's also talking about pipelines. In short, since Western tactics is wedded to crusading fronts, since jihad must be grasped as a strategic and remote assault on idolatry without manifest transgression, the first task of Islam's politics and militarization is to look for or to engineer a dynamic vector or a neutral vehicle to smuggle and mobilize Islamic war machines. Also, no mention of biopolitics at all in this entire discussion. And by that, I mean, well, what's the medium in which you transfer this idea, according to Reza? Well, I don't know. Bodies? Immigration? Sorry, my like inner right winger just comes out reading this stuff. I literally wrote that on my notes. I was like, I literally just wrote immigration here. I was like, excuse me.
Yeah, really, because like, and you're taking the idea seriously. It's like, okay, I'm going to take these seriously. Where is the mention of that? Just like Israel, but like, where's the mention of actual genetics? And you say bio a lot for someone who's kind of trying to remove this from genetics at all costs.
Yeah, so I'll just go down here for a second. Since tactics is dynamism or mode of movement, belongs to war machines rather than to the divine, is connected to human logistics or line of command, jihad can only use a platform of movement which transports war machines naturally, or to be exact, through a property of the divine. There is nothing more appropriate and more relevant here than oil. Islamic apocalypticism has understood well that anything can be pumped into gas pipelines, and oil will slide it forward as well as permanently dissolving it, meaning whatever reaches the crusading civilizations cannot be extracted or separated from petroleum. And this is where I made that joke about you're not getting that stain out. Oil cannot be politically distilled. The entities in oil participate in a new chemical compound which cannot be broken into its elements or main constituents. For the other side of the pipeline of the West, the point of evacuation and consumption, everything in oil remains under constant camouflage, nothing but a petroleum byproduct, a world of plastic. I'm reminded of Chad Hagg. The military magic of taking oil as a medium of movement rather than tactics unfolds when one claims that oil, as a natural entity itself, is part of nature and is a planetary entity, thus omnipresent despite different degrees of concentration on the Earth. If Islamic war machines are dissolved within oil, and oil is omnipresent planetary entity, then Islamic militarization is not local anymore, but global and planetary. That I agree with. The rise of oil as a medium for the mobilization of war machines heralds the decline of tactical offense and the dawn of a ubiquitous offense embedded within a seemingly peaceful omnipresence of nature.
There's a few ideas he established there, because you could be forgiven for thinking like my earlier comments by saying Islam is portrayed as this cancer. What does cancer do? Cancer spreads. And he is saying that no, it's not inherent for Islam to spread. Of course, we disagree with that. But within his framework, he's saying that, you know, Islam is defensive. It invites in, but it needs to spread war some other way. And that really is the framework that he's using, that, okay, these countries, insofar as they are Islamic and not just, you know, from a new realist perspective, doing power politics, but they're exporting oil to the rest of the world, specifically America, almost to infect them with war and to drive, you know, and to create this entire atmosphere, this entire ecosystem of war. So rather than attacking, they are attacking through oil to make the nations more warlike. And oil, remember, is this Tellurian entity that they do not create, they do not control. It just moves through them, and they are, in essence, slaves to it.
If you want to go down just a couple of pages to 87, I'm skipping ahead, but this is, I think, this is the last big part here that's important for what he's getting here. In a secret twist fueled by enthusiasm more Islamic than Islamic entities themselves, the berserkers of capitalism rush towards Islamic apocalypticism by fusing its war machines running through oil. When it comes to seeing through the pipeline, the machines of enlightenment are particularly petro-mongoloid. I like that phrase. But also, again, if you're going to call capitalism something, for the big conversations over the petrodollar, there you go. A war against intrinsicity. Kind of. There's almost this blending of the Kierkegaardian idea of the leveling, but it's done through a very Islamic lens in which oil is the medium that will permeate and penetrate all things, and that is by which, like, this Islamic understanding of the world will permeate through all things. And by that, really, we're doing the work of oil. But to carry on here, if any movement in a conductive material produces a magnetic field as in an electric current, then the gas pipeline where oil and Islamic war machines move must produce an immense magnetic field of combined strategies between Islam and the earth, swirling and encircling the tube. This is where we will get diagrams later on in the book about the earth's magnetosphere. The Middle East stalks the world as a as a petrol. Is there anything more Lovecraftian than building a new pipeline, winding its blobbing flutes? The question is, how long can the cavernous sentience ride in this modern vehicle? Thomas Gold's theory of deep, hot biosphere suggests that petroleum is not a fossil fuel, that oil has its origin in the natural gas flows which feed on bacteria living in the bowels of the earth.
And this is what we were getting at earlier.
Yeah, oil is alive. Therefore, the demonarchy, again, demons, of oil is not subjected to the laws of the dead, i.e. the preserved corpses of prehistoric organisms, but is animated by a plutonic vitalism. And we've talked about plutonics before, very early on, about the history of the earth and trauma, geotrauma. Is animated by plutonic vitalism, abiogenic petroleum generated by nether biospheres of the earth. Petroleum surfaces of primordial origins, thus it is not of the earth, but of the outside, planted here as a xenochemical. So some panspermia for you. Oil is produced by plutonic forces and neither by the biosphere, rather than from the decomposition of fossils and organic body counts. Consequently, oil is far more substantial and follows a different autonomous logic of planetary distribution. Taking Gold's theory as petropolitical ground has a different, far more strategic impact on the aforementioned pipeline scenario. If oil is somehow undying, undead, then so also are the war machines dissolved in it until such a time as they accomplish their task on behalf of the insider of the earth, i.e. oil, or on the behalf of monotheism and the divine.
And just to underscore that, I should have used the term the outside before. I know Nick Land speaks of outsideness, but when I speak of, other dimensions or other realms or other realities, that's what it is. That, oil is the insider of the outside. It is the incursion into our realm, our existence, from whatever is on the outside of it through holes and, in a sense, through oil. And so it is kind of the dead, but what does that actually mean? You know what I mean? So it's not literal. I think that's what will help people understand it, that you need to look at this way more philosophically and poetically. Like, what is death? It's death and war manifest. Where does that come from? It is the apex of entropy. And so there's an entropy that is encasing all of reality, and then it is drawn into the earth, and it wants to inhabit the earth. And so does it want to destroy it? Not necessarily. Does it want to consume it? Maybe as a consequence, but it's more just matter attracting antimatter, and then what intelligences lurk in that. And I don't love his references to Lovecraft. In fact, I might have to be done with Lovecraft for a long time, just because people throw it in like hot sauce.
Oh, I mean, Abdul al-Hazred comes up several times in this book.
Yeah,
for those who know their H.P. Lovecraft.
It's almost just a gesture towards, oh, look, big entities you can't understand, but it never improves anything. I'm not saying anything against Lovecraft. The worst people are too into Lovecraft is the problem. And I would just like to see it removed from this. I don't want to hear about the old ones. I don't want to hear about mind-bending entities. Just fucking forget about it. Describe it in some other fucking way. We must move past it. Read another book. Sorry. Do you want to keep going in this part?
I think the only thing there is just at the end, is the last sentence here, because this is sort of a big part of the text, I think. Yes, in short, oil trade in the Islamic network of petropolitics is primarily used to recharge and benefit neither the wealth of countries nor the production of spheres, but the pipeline itself. And by pipeline, we don't mean just like physical oil pipelines, but the pipeline in which this entity beneath the earth, in which oil is alive, is now raging a war against the sun, against capital, against monotheism, which were these tools that actually this oil itself, this germline, created in order to spread itself. So you're given actually a very rational, materialist explanation for religion. You're given a materialist explanation for why things are the way that they are, and that Islam is this medium to spread the Tyrolean lube of oil, in which we are now going to create basically some form of the apocalypse in some form or fashion. And we can reference Zoroastrianism, Babylonian texts and epics, Islam, and the Bible. And it's all going to just sort of be there. And this is where I feel very X-File-y, where all these Near East religions come together to explain something that everyone's only got a sliver of understanding of and gets lost in the metaphysical sauce, when in fact there's actually a rational scientific, or in this case, fictional scientific explanation for what it is. And it's way more terrifying because, cosmic horror, and here we are, you're nothing.
I'm just looking at Sean Wyland's quote here. Joe Rogan's right. Oil is an ancient alien technology. I wouldn't even call it technology. It could be understood as oil is that which causes us to even create technology. You would have to invert that. But I'm just looking at a section here. I kind of want to just keep moving into this this area here. The major hyperstitional entities of the ancient enemy, or oil, because oil is referred to as the ancient enemy in this. It is the enemy of mankind. It's the enemy of the earth. It is causing all of the problems, as traced by the ancient Middle Eastern cult of the Blob, or the people of Naft, meaning oil, are frequently referred to as Naftanese, a cult reconvened after the execution and disappearance of Ankh, are as follows. The hunter of the Dead Seas, Ghul in Naft, or the oil fiend in old Arabic and Farsi fictions and folklore, stalks over the deserted plains of Arabia. The nether blob, an anorganically synthesized material seething up from the primal interstellar bacterial colonies existing in the bowels of the earth. Once again, referencing the deep hot biosphere. According to Gold, since oil is anorganically produced by existing bacteria inside the earth, oil reservoirs are to some extent renewable, perhaps even inexhaustible. The black corpse of the sun is number 4. Parsani's later occultural, archaeological, and theoretical notes elaborately follow the abstract diagram of petroleum as a broken star, a broken decagon with triangles arranged on its sides. Parsini insists that oil, or the Tellurian pest worshipped by the Oct and is called, can be grasped numerically on the economic plane. An autonomous chemical weapon belonging to Earth as both a sentient entity and an event. Petroleum poisons capital with absolute madness, is what he says. A planetary plague bleeding into economies mobilized by the technological singularities of advanced civilizations. Hydrocarbon corpse juice, a post-apocalyptic entity composed of organic corpses flattened, piled up, and liquidated in sedimentary basins. Geologists suggest that if a high sedimentation rate preserves organic material, a catastrophic sedimentation rate would uproot, kill, and bury organic material. He's trying to just like all the different interpretations of what oil actually is. Number 8, Gaia's aromatic juice. Refuses to elaborate. The pipeline crawler, or Go Juice, a code name for an autonomous vehicle which smuggles Islamic war machines into Western civilizations. That's another way to explain what Prue was just saying. An autonomous vehicle, meaning it controls itself, which smuggles Islamic war into Western civilizations. But on the other side of the panorama, it is in fact the slow penetration of other narrative entities of petroleum into the rectal depths of all political orientations, whether formulated on religious platforms or not. And again, we see the narrative, we see the story, and we're going to connect this to plot holes in a second. But remember how this started by saying that these sort of ancient demonic gods, they deal in narratives, they corrupt stories, they are plot holes, so but these things can infect political narratives, which in a sense, if we're just treating this as poetry, you would say, okay, oil takes over our ideologies. It takes over our political positions. It corrupts all of that and brings it into the trap door of the Middle East and the trap door of oil. And that there's a case to be made that as technology advances, you become entrapped more by oil. If we are proceeding towards the Kurzweilian singularity, oil becomes so critical to our existence. We will become slaves to oil. That's another way to imagine what he's saying. What do you think about all that?
Well, that's really the big takeaway with the reference to sort of just like the petrochemical being everywhere, and that all of our politics now are, what did he say? We live under a petro-political system. And I think I mean, I referenced Chad Hagg earlier, and I think he has a line somewhere in either one of his books or one of his talks where he had said something along the lines of like, when mankind, like when this period of history is dug up in like a fossil record, there's just going to be like this inch thick layer of plastic. And you know, this kind of hits hard here in that respect.
Yeah. So I wanted to get a bit more into whole space or holy space, because this is, again, I thought this was silly when I first heard it, but you know, the more I meditated on it and the more I realized that he was trying to talk about narrative incursion and trying to spatialize the idea of a plot, because you know, at the core of this there's a very Western proclivity to spatialize and systematize and imagine the narrative as a landscape that you can inhabit. It's something that grows and something that takes on a life of its own, which is, I think, a distinctly modern phenomena. So, you know, something, if there is, if we spatialize the plot and there's a hole in the plot, what does that hole represent? How does that happen? It's a lapse in logic, but it's something else if you treat the narrative landscape seriously. So, you know, I started liking the most preposterous part the most. So I'm looking at page 57 here. It says, according to Parsani, the Earth always plays the role of a subversive insider against the empire of the sun, which has given rise to terrestrial orders, politics, and modes of living based on its hegemonic stardom. In his writings, Parsani calls this model of insurgency and participation, which is sometimes equated to the Horald. I don't know even what he could be trying to say there, but anyway, Horald body of the earth or non-holistic terrestriality, Kazajar. The term Kazajar technically and linguistically eludes translation, but might be rendered with considerable mutilation as whole complex, or more accurately, and then there's like a two, you know, he's being, again, cute here, whole complex with a hole that he drew with two brackets. Anything Middle Eastern can, it seems, only be examined or even emphasized with in the wake of petrological reason and whole complex. These two unholy, you know, he's being funny here using the word whole and holy like this. Two unholy elements constitute the foundations of that instrument of inquiry and analysis identified by Parsini's bewildering term, bacterial archaeology. Holy space, or more accurately, whole complex, speeds up and triggers a partial subversion in solid bodies, such as the Earth. It unfolds wholes as ambiguous entities, oscillating between surface and depth within solid matrices, fundamentally corrupting the latter's consolidation and wholeness through perforations and terminal porosities. So again, this is what we were saying before. This idea is introducing that, you know, it's attracted to solid, it's attracted to hegemony, the hegemonic nature of our world as a perfect, unified material plane. It wants to intrude on that. For a, he goes on here, for a solid body, the vermiticulation of holes undermines the coherency between the circumferential surfaces and its solidity. The process of denigrating or degenerating a solid body by corrupting the coherency of its surfaces is called ungrounding. According to Lovecraft, the realism of horror is built upon poromechanics. Lovecraft's poromechanical universe, or whole complex, is a machine to facilitate the awakening and return of the old ones through convoluted compositions of solid and void. So that would be another way to phrase what he's talking about. It is the void puncturing through the earth, and to undermine its coherency, because that's what it wants to do. It wants to attack perfection and coherency. Would that be an accurate summary, do you think?
I think so.
Yeah, and so continuing on here, just to make sure I have everything here. Here we go. Just going a bit more to holy space. Holy space is nothing but a composition of solid and void. Because what is a whole, right? What is the, you know, imagine Reza staring at a hole. That's what I would chuckle to myself, imagining, how did you come up with this? Well, you probably looked at a hole and said,
this hole was made for me.
This hole, well, this hole is made for everyone, and here's why that's a bad thing. But yeah, he's looking at a hole like, what is a hole? Well, it's its absence of material, but you can only have a whole surrounded by material. So it's this oscillation between the ground and unground and existence and absence. So you can see the gears turning on, contemplating the nature of a whole. I'm like, okay, that's kind of interesting. I don't dislike that. He says, holy space is nothing but a composition of solid and void, a vermicular one borrowed by worms, or vermicular lines convoluting anything they touch, overspreading the whole complex as a vast altar which asks for the solid as a sacrificial meal, awakening thousands of vermiculating lines to scour the solid and carve a polished, leering cue out of it. In any composition, the solid narrates the anomalies generated by the void or the infection of the void through the solid. When the void comes to the solid, it works as a convoluting plague, a coiling, swirling epidemic, rather than a nullifying process or a solid annihilating agent. In a composition, there is no pure solid, but a defiled one, a diseased and deflowering solid. And so he develops that much later in the book about, like, it's not just a violent puncture. It is decay. It is something that kind of spreads. A hole bequeaths more holes. It's something that, defiles. And we use that. There's that word that keeps popping up in this book, defiling. Like the void defiles the material. And its mere existence makes you want to propagate itself and spread like a plague rather than something that's truly violent. Sean Weiland, of course, saying, avoid the noid.
You got to try. You got to try. Really, if there was one sentence that I feel like kind of explains the big gist of the book, it's going to just be on 186. I'm just going to read it here real quick. He's referencing Parsani. Squirming its way into ever more convoluted coils, the Middle East develops a life form of its own by which any standards must be admitted as a peculiar Middle Eastern response to these three ancient enigmas. By casting creation aside, this life form builds worlds and corpses more efficiently than God. And this is what we're referring to with the oil. Those three enigmas, of course, are as follows: the degeneration of the whole and the absence of a complete erasure or destruction, referred to as poromechanics or the whole complex; petrological reason and the geopolitics of petropolitical undercurrents, referred to as the Tyrolean lube, oil. 3, the enigma of openness on oil levels of or ale levels of economics, politics, religion, life, communication, etc. If the Middle East for Persani is an sentient living entity, its activities swirl around these three enigmas, riddling them to a greater extent and with each and every twist. And that is definitely why, if it's a living entity and it's going to swirl around, well, we've got to infect everything. That's the oil. There's your cancer, and there's your Islam.
Yeah, he's trying to say it spreads without saying it spreads. As many people have pointed out, Islam seems to want to spread. So to say that jihad is all about defense, well, he just says it's defense, not even invitation, but they had to create a new way to wage war, to which we would say, well, what about the planes? What about what about the stabbings? Because there was stabbings and shootings even back then. It's not a thing that started happening in 2018. So I guess he needs to forget that part, just like he forgot about Israel. But like I said, what I liked about this was like a psychoanalyzation of the Middle East as one coherent region. Maybe that's where it gets it wrong, honestly, that I don't think he gets granular with the politics, and I don't think he really gets that granular with the different sects of Islam. And I think you need to, but he speaks about the Middle East like a Westerner, just as this one, hegemonic block, and it's not. And so that's always in the back of my mind, saying that like all these Muslims are just kind of possessed by the same demon. Like, I don't know, that betrays a lack of complexity and understanding. Of course, he's from the region, but like I said, he paints with too broad a brush when he's talking about these forms of politics, and also that,
he's also painting a really, really broad brush for what most Muslim orthodoxies, I mean, it varies sect by sect, but I mean, like the broad strokes of Islamic's like end times and the end of the world, their version of Judgment Day where everyone comes back and that gets skipped over everywhere. Basically, just simply we're getting instead a sort of accelerationist immanentization of the eschaton, and we're not, and he's like, he's talking about idols and being brought down, and it's like, okay, yes, the world of Islam is incredibly iconoclastic in all forms of imagery, idols, statuary, etc. And hence their own, calligraphic and written traditions, and their own artwork that doesn't depict anything unless it's with the word that comes from their own scripture. And yet, for him, at least in this text, it's like, well, in this case, like, well, that's all being destroyed, but that's already happening now. Like in the end times, like I mentioned earlier, it's like, well, I mean, like the crosses get destroyed, all idols and all non-religions that don't follow Allah and the messenger Muhammad as prophet, that all gets destroyed. But instead, we're kind of just, shifting it over just to sort of apply to our contemporary geopolitical moment, circa late 2007. Which, I mean, you can't separate that at all from this text. Like, it doesn't read as well now because we're not talking about the Middle East as much. When we talk about maybe oil or pipelines, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about Eastern Europe. We're talking about Ukraine. We're talking about Nord Stream. We're not really as invested as we are as we could in this case. And even if you were to tell me that, like, this is a defensive structure and the entities around here trying to compete against gods or to compete against the sun, well, they're too busy just, I don't know, killing each other in Syria right now to really make this a compelling argument for me.
Oh, and also before I forget, every episode we do has some linguistic artifact. I think Tellurian lube is going to be the one from this. People
That's
have fun
true.
with their spines. They have fun with their Oedipal complexes and whatnot.
You gotta lube up your spine with the Tellurian lube.
Imagine someone who only watched this show. There's no other thing they watch. So I'm going to give people like a shotgun blast of weird stuff. I'm trying to stay on the holy space idea.
Yeah, go ahead.
And admittedly, in reading this book and extracting notes and really reorganizing the notes in advance of the show, I found a new appreciation for the ideas. I didn't hate it as much as I thought. Once I could, strip some of the stuff away, and sometimes ideas are developed later on and they're referenced all over the place. But if you stack them up, you see the coherent through line and you're like, okay, I can do something with that. Although Johnson in the chat made a good point, you could debate this central theory that does the void attack the solid or does the solid attack the void? Is it possible to recast this relationship where our hegemonic unity of our universe is actually an incursion into the void? That's one way to look at it. And is space itself, is deep space also attacking the void? Does that exist outside of this universe entirely? So I think there's a way to invert this. And that to me is almost more interesting because there's an underlying negativity in a lot of this CCRU stuff where, of course, the dominant force is punishment and torture and entropy. But I find it more interesting and maybe even illuminating to say that, this would necessarily be the more religious and Christian angle, that it is the mind of God. It is Logos that is, spreading throughout.
Well, I think Reza makes his to answer the chatter's question. I feel as if Reza makes it kind of very clear to what affects what directly. I don't know if you can flip it, but this is the argument Reza makes. It's on page 189 if you want to go to it. I think this is a fun little, you want to talk about holy spaces and holes in general. This is where you can also jump off from here.
I do want to talk about holes.
Who doesn't? Bottom of page 189. That last paragraph. There you go. Is this the one I'm thinking of? Or am I... no, it's going to be... no, 188. Bottom of 188, sorry. There you go. So there, we'll read here. Decay can concretely, in the sense of pragmatism and political consequences, erase the definition of power by positioning P, mocked, over zero without solid, P divided by zero, as a process delineated not by dissolving power, but by keeping power alive within obscure hosts. An undead political machine, a Middle Eastern system, reveals its true lineaments in its decay. The utilization of power in a decaying system is a necrophilic experience. Decay mars power on virtual surfaces of zero, there to be rotten and reeked up, but above all, decay leaches death from the living without falling into the black transparency of death. While the advent of death heralds the end of any capacity for affording more, the reign of decay begins with the loss of such capacity. The progress of death, or this progressive death, which cannot eventuate complete removal or total destruction, can only be tasted through decay in its differentiated mess. Decay introduces power to the misadventures of matter, but it is entities as beings which narrate the adventures of decay as a cosmic odyssey between themselves. In decay, the limit and lineaments of objects are put to a test. A hyena is built out of a dog's corpse, which in turn generates plants, small maggots within smaller worms, within countless squirming bodies. The awakening of different species from a corrupting entity is inherent to decay. It is the unsettling revelation, as the German scholastic philosopher Henry of Hesse the Elder suggests, that it is not clear whether all men are of the same species or not, and so too with dogs and horses. Corpses which had been of the same species when living might differ in species from one another when corrupted. During decay, taxonomic indetermination and sheer equivocality blur the boundaries, not only between what different species, but also between different entities of the same species. When associated with decaying political systems, such obscurity suggests an ominous socio-political twist. To say that a decaying political system traverses and encompasses other political systems is dismaying enough, but to add to any political system, whether developed or democratic, I like that differentiation, developed or democratic, might be differentiated gradient of decaying politics is an unfathomable insinuation. Long story short, to your question, for Reza, that relationship is really just one way, that it is entropy itself that is going to rule over matter, and it's going to rule over all things.
Yeah, and that's the arc of the book that I liked the most, and that was my main takeaway. Like I said, the through line is entropy, but by the end of the book, he's toying with this idea that when we think of decay, we think of death. The association is obvious with death, but he just sees that as another form of life, if not the ideal form of life, because we're talking about, I don't even want to say the word ideal. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but inevitable, that like the grand leveling of hegemony to just the desert, making everything the desert, and the desert defined as this landscape of decay, something that's always decaying, not as a form of death, but maybe even the ultimate form of life. And maybe I'm just layering too much of my stuff on that, but like when he talks about dust, we'll get to that in a second if we have enough time, because we are getting to close to 2 hours.
Let's do dust as the last thing, and then we can sort of wrap up our thoughts.
But I like that. During decay, taxonomic indetermination and sheer equivocality blur the boundaries, which is what he says, that the grand leveling of all humanity that Islam is seeking. And as the agents of that Tellurian lubricant, of these war machines as war by different forms, like I get all that, but he's basically saying that entropy is a form of life, which is interesting to me. That holy space isn't just a void. It is this oscillating interplay between the material world and the void as its own thing, as a new form of life. So it's like the transition between life and death being the ultimate and maybe the eternal form of life that can be kept in stasis, which is different than spinal catastrophism, because there it's a lot simpler. Maybe that's unfair.
No. I think you're right, because I mean, for instance, what is the answer to spinal catastrophism at the end? What is the ruined orgasm of that text, other than Moynihan saying, "Well, our attempt at evolution and having a spine and higher levels of consciousness is to escape trauma and pain. In order to escape trauma and pain, everything must die. We must be so self-assured in our own self-destruction, not a single opportunity for life to ever exist ever happens again. That's it. Whereas this is, which I think is kind of a simplistic, just kill yourself narrative. Whereas Reza here gets the interesting inverse of that, where actually decay introduces a cycle of history that does not end, because in the death and in the decay are new things born out of it. And almost samsara like in some extent. But
yeah, because the spell
yeah.
catastrophism, if people recall, the end point of that book is saying that it is the sole ambition of intelligent life in the form of humanity as the ultimate form of intelligent life to advance to such a degree that you can not only destroy the universe but prevent another universe from ever forming. So it's creating an eternal conflagration that is anti-life. So in a sense, you need death to become a new form of life. You must have a form of chaotic death that's constantly revivifying itself. So it's never just dead. It's never static. So within spinal catastrophism, you have the endpoint being just violence upon violence as life. And here you have decay as life. In neither of these models do you have just the utter stasis of eternal darkness of death. But it's you never achieve death. It's just life as anti-life, if that makes any sense. And so those are the parallel stories being on here. I think those are the sorts of concepts that emerge from this expanded CCRU universe. And if there's one pattern you can recognize, I think it's going to be, and even Nick Land gets in this when he says like nothing human survives in the future. Like he's even playing around with the idea of life itself, human life having to become something else that we might even identify as hostile to our former life. But our entire understanding of life in the future must mutate into something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like I mean, really a big part about this dynamism that he talks about is the dynamism in decay that we have in the world of decay, and he gets later on in the book that there is this, and it's also where he also reintroduces the whole sort of plot hole stuff too. Is that and I was really reminded of Dark Souls. It's a terrible comparison, but my brain went to it because it's its own fiction. Like things get lost in the lands, in the sands of time, where time is convoluted. And for Reza, he says, convoluted space is in decay, in between war and peace, redness and whiteness, hot and cold, and these enact sort of a blindness on our understanding of the world, and that's sort of what makes the Middle East so strange to the rest of the world, because it has a blindness towards death that can only happen because death is part of our world and entropy is there and we're never really going to escape it. And so we have these convolutions between the void and the solid, between the whole complex and the whole of the world, generation and degeneration. And again, this circles back to the Alpha and the Omega, the Gog and the Magog from the very beginning. And there you bring ourselves to the fact that actually, people would say, "Oh, well, that makes sense. Like from dust thou art, and to dust you shall return." And then Reza's like, "No, actually, it's way more than that. And for you to think that that's all that you are, and dust you will return, that is just you coping as a monotheist." And it's just like, okay, why don't we go there then? If you wanted to go there, because I know you wanted to talk about dust real quick.
Oh well, let me just I kind of wanted to get to plot holes quickly too.
Oh, sure, we can do both.
So I'm going to just do. I'm just going to read a bunch of stuff in quick succession because I want to talk about Nemat space. Nemat space is an ultimate crawling machine. It is essentially cryptogenetic and interconnected with anonymous until now. Anonymous until now is the model of time and whole complex, whose probes and lines of itinerancy move unpredictably according to both the subsoil and superficial ungrounding machineries that weaken the solid by perversely exploiting and manipulating it. So we take that and then we go to page 84 because I had to sort of tie some of these. I think you already did part of this, but
Yeah, go ahead.
It's right here. Nemet space is only as a Nemet space does the Earth endure, an opening through its hole, a hollow body drawing its cartographies on the surfaces of the whole complex. The awakening ritual that the cult of the old ones practices by surreptitiously speed the return of the elders involves messing with the solid part rather than submitting to the void. Such a mission constitutes advanced remodifications and operations on the solid part of holy space, opening yawning pits as zones of their rebirth. Now we take that and we just hop over to page 70 here. There. So it says the militarization of the contemporary world, both in its politics and its concrete approaches, is architecturally, visually, and psychologically paradoxical precisely because its agencies, as in War on Terror, are shifting from the logic of grounded Earth to poromechanical Earth and the logic of whole agency. So just to wrap up the idea that war itself is changing it's changing to this new type of war that is more embracing of the idea of the whole complex. Now, just jumping to page 76, because I need to get this down because I mentioned plot holes. So here it is. It says, a plot hole does not operate on behalf of an absence, that the object of critic scorn, but registers and conveys the activities of the subsurface life. So here we go. What is a hole? What's it communicating beneath the surface? Plot holes are psychosomatic indications of at least one or more plot density populating itself in the holes it burrows through and digs out. However, the propagation of plot holes in hidden writing is not merely the evidence of actual independent plots beneath and through the visible surface of the so-called main story or books within a book. More importantly, it's the indication of the active inauthenticity and anti-book distortions that hidden writings carry. One of the most prominent examples of hidden writing is Johannes Thermidius's treatise on Black occult and scholastic astrology, Steganographia, written in 1499. This grimoire lacks any superficial coherent plot or consistency, as if it has been infested by plot holes and various losses of content and theme. So here you have, again, the plot hole as it's not even like a book within a book. It's just something else like springing up through, but what is a hole? Again, a hole just isn't just a hole in the ground. Of course it can't be. It has to be some other thing that's coming through. So, and lastly, he gets into memory holes here on page 83. Okay, so he says,
you see why, chat? I really do think that I just read this shit and I'm like, oh, this is just something out of the SCP wiki circa 2011.
Yeah. So one other thing, what it looks like is this.
There you go.
This is my person. Wow, that shit doesn't mean anything at all. This is kind of what you're looking at here.
This is one of the few rare tweets that is not horny from Mart.
Yeah, like wow, shit, that doesn't mean anything at all. Like you can be forgiven for thinking that as well. Hold on, let me just get back to the. Here we go. So, just continuing on, it does sound like SCP, doesn't it? If memory holes cause such accessibility problems for the subject, it is because they have been specifically designed for being accessed from the other side. Right. So we're taking the idea of a hole. Well, how does that apply to plot holes? How does that apply to memory holes? Anytime you've heard of a hole, finish that sentence. Like what is a vagina? What is a vagina if not communication from the other side? And brother, that's not another side you want to talk to. This is why cunnilingus should be avoided at all costs. Moving on. In this sense, memory holes are accessible not for the subject and its integrated self, but for that which is exterior to the subject and has no self. If memory holes are channels for trafficking data and retrieval from the other side, then each human or subjective attempt to recall involves an invocation or stepping into the memories of an outsider. What is going on here? Why did it stop sharing?
It's still sharing on my end.
Okay, hold on.
Did your tab freeze up?
I don't know
There
what's
you
happening.
go. It's moving.
Okay, I don't know. It's just not appearing on my side. Whatever. Let's keep moving on here. If memory holes are channels for trafficking data and retrieval from the other side, then each human or subjective attempt to recall involves the invocation of or a stepping into the memories of an outsider. Memory gaps, with their space-time lapses, function as a whole complex through which nether entities seep through, rush towards our world. Memory gaps are the instruments of their homecoming. So if you've ever tried to remember something, if you have a gap or a lapse in your memory, by you attempting to remember that, you are in essence communicating with something else, and maybe something else comes through. The natural conclusion here obviously is that I guess people with Alzheimer's are just demons, right?
They're the ultimate infected entity.
Now, do we want to? I think we can get to dust. Would you like to? Do you have anything to say on dust? Because I got a part here I can read.
Go ahead and
Just
read it,
set
and
up.
I'll get my own notes up here.
So, two things here on page 101. Parsani names dust the Middle Eastern unit of information, which sounds like a racist fact that we would come up with. That would find its place as the punchline of a Stone Toss comic. But the dust is the Middle Eastern unit of information, or sometimes even that Middle Eastern relic from which nothing can escape. Zero data, or dust, swarms planetary bodies as a primal flux of data, or the mother of all data streams in the solar system. Each particle of dust carries with it a unique vision of matter, movement, collectivity, interaction, effect, differentiation, composition, and infinite darkness. A crystallized database, or a plot ready to combine and react to be narrated and through something. Here, Parsani's remark that the Middle East is the dust swamp of the earth develops a fictional edge saturated by new literary theoretical problems of storytelling. Only oil can settle the dust of the Middle East, declares Parsani. Both dust is real nomadic entity because it migrates elsewhere, spiriting itself away as an elusive ground, a bogus state. So I liked that. Like, that's one of the parts I really like, the idea of centering dust and sand, I guess, but maybe he sees dust and sand as the same thing, as these grains that carry and move, and it's central to that identity.
It is partially, but also that dust is still something that is used as part of life. It's not like the end. It's not the end of what we're reduced to. In fact, we can go further and be broken down further. It's just a building block in which things are built on. You know, we can't be so reductive with regards to what we are in terms of the phrase "dust." You are. Let me pull it up. You are. Let me see if this is it. Where are my? Oh, that's frustrating. Let me make sure I have it. But basically, the other thing too about monotheism that Reza gets onto, he says that if there was an end of history, i.e., an end of monotheism, he would argue that Islam is the form of it, and it will inevitably, you already have Sharia law despite your fears about it, and that it is going to be with this sort of hubris, what he would call Aryan characteristics, building off of his Persian background, that you are now going to have an economia that will bring about its own apocalypticism in due time, and that you cannot just simply take it for what it is. And if anything, there's this Islam is just a form of Mesopotamianism that communicates a new birth of society and a new birth of time, and that the Middle East is what's going to spread about and bring about the end, and oil is the way it will do it.
Yeah, and just to keep on that rail of dust, he says, dust is not the surplus of the ground's groundness and the sun's thermonuclear capitalism. Quite on the contrary, Authorial genesis and creation are the surplus of the dust's mess hysteria. Creation is the surplus value of the Ouroboros cycle of the pest, which lays its eggs via devouring, twisting, and materialism. Dust is a dry torrent towards an outside, only plausible as pest. If the morphology of weapons has to undergo a revolution in the war on terror, that revolution can only take place through morphing into dust and spores, providing weapons with cutting-edge compatibility with the socio-political sphere, belief dynamics, people, and geography of war. Now that actually sounds realistic, saying that the morphology of war will be, what are nanobots, what are drones, what is the, making weaponry into autonomous flows. Now, this is obviously before that time. I would imagine Reza would look upon swarms of drones, insofar as he actually believes this, and this isn't just a literary flight of fancy, but he would look at it seems to be weaponry is advancing into the realm of artificial intelligence and swarms and drones.
And this is also why he talks about how you can't ever really get rid of that oil. And he spends a very early page on talking about like jungle warfare, specifically Vietnam, and how that now comes to the Middle East. And now that you're dealing with sort of like desert warfare or desert techniques, because for Parsani, and really by extension, we just really mean Reza here, dust itself is the ultimate tool. It's the ultimate nomad. It's the ultimate nomad war machine because it can migrate elsewhere. It can blow itself everywhere. And dust itself will spread throughout all parts of the world. And so, because it's, part of that, it contaminates all of the sort of Abrahamic monotheistic religions on Earth that are so dominant. The order of the divine or the order of oil can now bring about dust everywhere and spread itself. And so, we're not just reduced from ash to ash, from dust to dust. If anything, even if you are reduced to that, whether that be through war, whether that be through decay or anything else naturally, you're still going to be able to spread. And this entity itself can now spread throughout the rest of the world. And that means whether it's be through pestilence, whether it be through, our pipelines of oil itself or through the war on terror, we are now going to be part of ourselves here in that fog of war, again, dust. Talking about the Hyperstition laboratory, if to dust is to kill and dust to dust is to render into nothingness, then we reach sort of this omega point where the apocalypse will be reached, where dust is spread throughout. And for him, for Reza, he's like, well, this is how Islam interacts in this part of the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know we need to get going soon, but I just want to read a couple more parts here.
Yeah, go for it.
I know you talked about, pestilence there. He says Pazuzu, the Sumero-Assyrian demon of epidemics, is an occult operative of the xeno-informatic abomination or dust. Pazuzu specializes in scavenging the stratified earth and its biosphere in the form of dust, which is then uplinked to alien currents flowing in the universe. These combinations of dryness and wetness are earned back to Earth to disseminate disease, according to the Assyrian axis of evil against evil. Pazuzu, the demon, feeds on dust, which is I think so, Kabbalistically equal to know God. The face is of limited relevance for a rigorous archaeological investigation into the demonic. Even the most distorted, disfigured, and grotesque faces cannot be identified as evidence of a demon. That is to say, defaciality cannot be a constitutive element in diagramming a demon. So I think that kind of summarizes where he goes with dust in this. But once I was reading that, it really connected if I'm being generous, the points he was trying to, establish here, which is he's not even condemning it. He's just saying this is what it is. If dust is the language of the Middle East, and as long as the Middle East persists, so will it seek to, again, I'm still not sold on the relationship he has between, it's defensive, but it's also spreading. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
the desert is that which invites, but which also spreads. And I don't know, that doesn't track for me. And maybe that's just me not getting it. Maybe I need to read it more deeply. But I think honestly, throughout this entire piece, I think we've given it credit where credit is due, right? I'm meeting it where it wants me to meet it.
Yeah, I feel as if we've kind of taken it as straightforward as I want to take it, in the sense there's a lot of stuff in here that's kind of interesting, in the sense that like there is evil against evil, there is all these sort of morphological demonologies of the past that now has kind of come up into this world because we've kind of brought them back. We've shaken the dust off of these archaeological relics due to the war on terror. And, remember, like we have to be very careful about what we're doing, because we have to be towards peace, i.e. to be aligned with the divine, but also like these, what is underneath the ground below us actually really just wants us to, prepare our hands and to make our fingers ready for war. And because of that, we will become machines that these entities will use to burn brighter than the sun itself and to be the thorn in the side of deities that are far beyond our understanding. But he breaks it down in a very sort of just, well, if we trace the archaeology and we trace these words and we get this enmity from Wahhabism and we break that down, we see all this, we're against all manifestations of da-da-da-da-da. You kind of see that race is just like, well, really, we can all just break this down. And if you follow me on this crazy, fictional tale that has some strange, like, religious dissonance, you'll understand that actually, like, you're fucked, and that's okay, because death brings about new life and we should rejoice. And
well, basically, and if I can just read a couple last parts, just tie this together. I'm looking at a place here. It says, probably the most effective way to grasp the war on/of terror is to grasp war as a machine. I want to read this because you've mentioned war as a machine a couple of times, and I think this really, establishes what we're talking about. War as a machine. The Deleuzian Guattarian model fails to exhume the undercurrents and subterranean processes at work in World War. He's calling this World War IV. This is why doesn't explain why, really. I don't. He just skipped World War. Maybe he's calling the Cold War.
The Cold War is World War III. He makes it explicit.
Yeah. All right. This is why Delta Force, the former secret military cult of Colonel West. Also, Colonel West is, correct me if I'm wrong, another fictitious character in this?
I'm pretty sure. Although I'm not going to lie, I like to envision, for the sake of my own humor, I think of that like black GOP pundit, like the Lieutenant Colonel Alan West guy. It just makes this more entertaining for me. I just think of a conserva boomer being this like central figure in this strange Middle Eastern World War IV. But
it's true. That's Hyperstition. It's whatever the fuck I want it to be.
Yeah, if he can have his fan fiction, so can I guess.
Yeah. This is why Delta Force had no success namifying the growing desert of Islamic apocalypticism. The reason for this failure was not because the Middle Eastern deserts have already grown, but rather, as Parsoni pointed out in his Rise and Fall of the Solar Empire, because the Middle East, as the only adherent partisan of the Assyrian doctrine of war, is not a geographical or even a political body, but a sentient process of desertification, which can be grasped only by presupposing that war is an autonomous entity free from its provocateurs. And really, that it is the summary of what we were talking before. War is a machine, and oil is its fuel. And we're but participants within that process. And that process is beyond us. We're possessed by it. And we're possessed by it insofar as we allow it to possess us, as the Islamists have. And again, I'm trying to be charitable here when I say just the Islamists and not all Muslims. I don't know why. I just am, because I think when he's speaking of these groups, it sounds like he's just speaking of Wahhabists. That's what I think. And also within the political climate and when this was written, I think that's who he's mainly talking about. And maybe they are the only true Muslims. And so just this one last part here on page 149. Here he's quoting, I think it might have been quoting Prasani here. It says, the future of jihad and martyrdom lies on the ashes of belief. With the eradication of belief, the Abrahamic war on idolatry will flourish unimaginably. Again, this is him describing all Abrahamic religions, all monotheism in its truest form as a war against idolatry, and which means the war against everything. He says early in the book, anything that erects off the earth. So the desertification of the world is
Yeah, specifically for Islam, like shirk and kufur.
With the eradication of belief, the Abrahamic war and idolatry will flourish unimaginably. It will be embellished by new meanings and new cutting edges. If you are impatient to learn what and where the future might be, consult a Wahhabi warrior. For the Wahhabis' belief is Mazre Shatem, Satan's farm. The faithful are Satan's farmers. How is it possible to live without belief? Ask a Wahhabi suicide bomber. They'll tell you it's the most responsible way of worshiping God, indistinguishable from fighting and from living. Desert enlightenment needs an ethics of war, not war machines, and the ethics of war only becomes real when it's practiced on the beliefs afterlife. And again, that's something that if you take away anything from this book, I think you could take that, remove it, and sort of meditate on that, about the nature of war. And honestly, I've never seen a critique of monotheism like this.
Same.
I'm not saying I necessarily like it, but it is interesting, and it's trying to portray it more than any anti-Christian I've ever seen, who say, "Oh, it's Jewish, right?" But it's like saying, no, all monotheism is the exact same. It just realizes itself either impurely or purely, but it is a rebellion against the material world. Maybe that's true, but what is the materialistic extension of that? Well, it's the desert in all its forms. And what is the desert if not the grand leveling of the material world? And then through that, I guess the holes in the oil and everything else. But, maybe this is just because I'm a dumb psycho. I'm trying to reconcile how that fits with, war as being, I keep using this word incursion, but it is outsideness. It is the outside attacking the hegemony. So all monotheism in that respect is just, we're all agents of that outsideness. However, he's not even saying that's necessarily bad, but I guess that is, like, if the future is this stasis of decay, like, that is the perfect synthesis. That is sort of the Hegelian dialectical synthesis between, that is the whole realized. That is, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like, it's and I guess this is what this book needed, a conclusion. It needed something. It needed a singular author to give it coherency, I think, even though it was written by a singular author, but it pretends it's not. So it says, here's a bunch of stuff, but I need it gathered up into something that, you know what I mean? Like, it's just strands that are left hanging there, right?
Yeah, I mean, really, and in fact, I almost, if I weren't playing it straight for the sake of the episode, because I literally stood up from, like, when I first finished the book and I got to the end, I just was like, all right, I'm done. I'm so done. I feel like I've just been tooled for like the couple of hours I spent sort of scribbling some notes and page numbers and ideas, because literally it just ends. At this point, the writing of Dr. Hamid Pisani, paleopetrologist and once distinguished professor of archaeology at Tehran University, becomes illegible, as if he intentionally scrambled the letters by turning each word into a strange and possibly self-invented rune or cipher.
It's the holes,
Specks
it's the
of
plot
dust,
holes.
only decipherable when stirred by the arid winds and oily wetness of the Middle East. And I'm just like, fuck you. I'm so done. I feel like I wasted my time. I still felt that way when I finished reading it today on my lunch break at work, and I was like, I'm done. I'm ready to just read like shitty SCP Red King fan fiction. Like,
but you know what?
I'm done.
Reading this back to back with Dune would be a trip. Because Vulpus Persona writes a comment here. God made Arrakis to test the faithful.
Yes, I mean, this is what it is. He's just like, God made Persia to test the faithful. God made Persia. God made the oil. The spice must flow. The oil must flow. It's just as if the CCRU fan fiction with the Barker, Charles Daniel Barker, met Arrakis, except there's no Fremen, there's no savior, there's no messianic figure, there's none of that. There's no Benny Gesserit. commensurate, but instead this entity underneath, there's no worm except the pipelines because the spice must flow. I'm done.
Yeah.
What a great way to finish it. Just
Yeah.
another book where I read. This is 2 books that are CCRU-esque or directly affiliated that end with just a ruined orgasm of intellectual masturbation. I'm done.
But like with spinal catastrophism, there are elements that will stay with you. And in reading this and talking about it, I'm going to carry that with me. I'm going to carry with me, as silly as it sounds, the holy space, the decay as eternal stasis, as the ultimate form of life. There's something that I don't know what to do with that, really. I don't know how to apply that, but I don't know. It's just an appendage to the central CCRU, the CCRU expanding universe, which we jovially call it. But that is a truly 21st century. One thing we had said on the show a long time ago is that I don't think we've seen a real 21st century ideology.
Not yet.
But I think a contender will one day emerge from the CCRU thing. Like I see the echoes, I see the pangs of something, and the way they're playing with time, and the way they're playing with time and stasis, but and this is the danger, from a truly nihilistic angle. And I do wonder if there's a way to crowbar that nihilism out of it. And like we had said before, a way to completely invert it into something a bit more positive, something that doesn't just doom us all, because really it's nihilistic in the sense that the only future is inhuman decay or perpetual revitalizing heat death of the universe. And if you reject that, but then what? There's building blocks within here I think we could use. And again, like I said, knowing that Reza had such a prestigious background in math, I wish that came through a bit more, or he was explaining the math that wasn't in a way that wasn't trying to obfuscate. Because every time there's numerology or anytime there's equations, I get the sense he's using it as seasoning. He's not actually trying to explain a mathematical idea. He's trying to say, look at this weird equation I found. But, if this is a man who understands math, like I would have appreciated he integrated that more, and it would have made it more interesting to me instead of just ornamental.
I want to give him another shot, but I want to read his latest book, Intelligence and Spirit. There's something because I want to see what he's like when he's not doing theory fiction.
Yeah. Like Thomas Moynihan just like moved away from spinal catastrophism into geopolitics too. So
no. I actually want to read a second book because I think it's called X or like the history of extinction or something like that.
Yeah.
Because what it is that he takes the conclusion of spinal catastrophism, like that mankind is ultimately aware of its own extinction, or that it can imagine its own extinction, and then he just builds off of that. And from what I've seen and read, he seems to be building off a little bit of like Nick Bostrom and a little bit of George Bataille. And I want to read it because I'm curious to see where he takes his nihilism. And then in the same way here, like Reza's book, Intelligence and Spirit, talks about intelligence. What is the ultimate form of it? And can it overcome our current state of affairs? Like that stuff's more interesting to me because it's messing with German idealism. But instead I've done 2 books now of these guys where it's theory fiction. Although I will thank Moynihan for not doing as much of that as Parsani does in this, or fucking Reza, whatever. It's the same guy.
If we leveraging all of our networks, everything that we can bring to bear, if we can do one stream where we get Reza, Moynihan, and Nick Land on, that might.
I don't think they would. I think that both of those two would say no if Nick came on. So like, I don't want to be on I'm already on a edgy podcast with 2 people that they would have no problem calling fascists. They don't want to talk to Nick.
Do they hate Nick Land that much? Because I don't
know. Because I mean, like the Plutonics geotrauma people, they call Nick Land like a burnout who just like regressed into fascism. And I'm like, Nick Land is still pretty much the same guy from 20 years ago. He's just more realistic about the fact that we're all killing ourselves with liberalism.
Also, to call Nick Land a burnout, he's the only one that is in any way culturally relevant.
Correct.
Like he's the only one that I would put him
like.
up
There
against...
are HRT addled like Zoomer theory cells that will read Fang Numina and True Now only to like have their hearts broken when they realize Nick Land is like talking to people like you and I.
But it's like for them to say like, oh, we're better than him. Like, no, you're immeasurably worse. It's like I would hold Nick Land up with, I've mentioned him before, Slavoj Zizek, as the only two, let's call them philosophers, that could get young people really fired up, really into this, and create proselytizers, people who are agents of these ideas out in the world. Like, who the fuck else? What the hell is going on r/philosophy, if not just talking about these two? Who else?
But I would love to interview Moynihan. I'm not gonna lie.
No, I'd love to. I'm not even being sarcastic. I'm not trying to troll anyone with this. Like, I liked, despite everything we've just said, despite all of the,
despite me saying that Moynihan and this book are ruined orgasms, I still want to talk to these people.
Oh yeah, Behold says Fisher, I assume he means Mark Fisher, and the acid communists despise him as well. It's so much for horseshoe theory.
Well, you know, if the acid communists and Fisher and the Fang Numina HRT kiddies are any form of horseshoe theory, it's that everyone acts themselves off in the end.
Honestly, I don't know why these guys can't all be friends. Like, they're too weird not to be friends.
I don't know why they can't be friends with each other. They all want to hang out, and they all eventually hang themselves.
Yeah, they all want to hang out, indeed. So I guess we'll just wrap it up here. We've gone a bit over. Simple question: would you recommend the book?
No.
No.
No, just because it pissed me off so much with its masturbatory theory fiction. Are there some cool ideas in here? Yes. Are there plenty of explainers, essays, and book reviews of this book? Yes. Go read those instead. I'm usually one to encourage you to read the primary text. I will probably reread this one more time, and I'm sure my opinion will change because there's a lot of shit we did not get into. Some of the Kabbalistic stuff we didn't get into. We didn't really dive into the germ theory of monotheism, although we kind of basically did with Zoroastrianism. There's a lot of stuff in here that, like, if I were to take a refresher course on some of these more ancient, you know, Mesopotamian, Babylonian myths and creatures and deities, I probably would appreciate it a lot more. But again, I'm also a Westerner, regardless of whatever I believe in. That's going to also limit my ability to maybe approach this in the way that Reza wants it to be approached. But nevertheless, the book is, you can pick this up and read it. It's going to explain everything for you. It's got a great glossary of terminology at the end. If you can look past it feeling like an SCP fan fiction story, then yeah, I mean, it's okay. You can read it. This is not a book that I would recommend. I would recommend Moynihan far quicker than I would Reza.
And I'll just end on this. And this is the part that I'm going to leave with, and maybe people can take this, run with it, meditate on it. He says, decay traverses and grasps dimensions as irreducible convolutions of solid and void, objects of infinite differentiation to the point where measures or dimensions lose their capacity to scale or to determine formative regulations. This event, however, does not lead to the erasure of dimensions or measures. So the inhabitable eternity of decay. And let that be where it stands. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. By the way, before we go, did you have any super chats or anything like that?
Just one from Son of Haster. He sent $5. He says, salute, just waiting for Abdul Al-Hazra to come up. Woefully underappreciated scholar. Well, he gets mentioned in the book for those who are familiar with their H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh, also, Willie McDuff for $10. Thank you for saving me the trouble of reading this myself. Well, that's why we're here, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's why we do this.
We read the books, so you don't have to.
Furthermore, we read so you don't have to read. This is a war on literacy, this show. if you watch a show, you should never have to read a book again. All right. So thank you everyone for taking the time, and thank you, Prudentialist. Amazing as always. There's links in the description